Hello and welcome to this video on the Orks of Warhammer 40,000. These are large, humanoid figures with a serious anger issue. They are perhaps some of the most unreliable, unexpected and unpredictable races. Orks play in one of two ways. Either the dice god loves you or hates you, and it nearly always falls one way or the other. Despite this, they have quaint and unique traits. Unlike some other species, the Orks can make something happen through sheer willpower. This warg power means they can make unrealistic aircraft, vehicles, and more happen by believing it to be so. If we ignore these supernatural elements, and the others that will come up, we can look at the Orks as a species. Let's begin with reproduction. You will note that we did not say sexual reproduction. A fully mature Ork is able to secrete spores as they breathe. This begins the life cycle of the Ork. The spore is very resilient and able to survive harsh conditions that are otherwise inhospitable to life. Less mature Orks, or Ork lineage, shed spores but at a much reduced rate. The spore eventually grows in size and presumably number to agglomerate into a fungus fruiting body, much like a mushroom. The mushroom gives rise to the squig being a small, somewhat sentient being that is extremely aggressive. As you can see here, there's an interesting movement into a squig and evolving, or at least adapting, into something along the lines of an orc. When we start looking at the orc lineage entirely by itself, we go from the fruiting body of the fungus into a snotling. The snotling is at least vaguely like an orc. It's bipedal, has 2 arms, a head and a body. If we take it that the snotling is able to grow and develop, then the next iteration makes sense. Much like as children lose baby fat, the snotling could turn into a Gretchen, a slightly more lean and much more orc-like creature. The Gretchen then eventually develops into the orc proper. This growth and change is not necessarily crazy. We have seen that caterpillars turn into pupae and then a butterfly. Each is a very different organism, but also a direct product of the predecessor. In a similar manner, we see the very faint lines of mycelium becoming the fruiting body of a mushroom. To a lesser extent, an egg becomes a bird or lizard. The problem is the changes we see and how quickly it happens. The exact details on how quickly an orc goes from being a snotling to a Gretchen and then an orc isn't clear, nor is it entirely clear how much time is needed for the spores to form the fruiting body and then eventually become a snotling. There is a viable argument to be made that, yes, if the development of these species occurs in particular ways, where you reach a critical mass, and that then produces the initial stages of the more advanced Ork-type format, then we have a sensible solution. We could see how the initial spores could build in number, the fruiting body being more of a signal of maturity, and the development of the orc-like creature underground as seen here. That would be more like a mushroom. But then we have the development from the snotling through to the orc, and these different iterations require more significant changes. We'll get into some of those and how they might work later, but for now understand that it is possible to see the physical adaptations and growths and changes if you think of it as something like puberty in humans. What we find really bizarre and weird, the orcs as a species engage in a quasi-cannibalistic culture, wherein the orc will eat the spores, the fungus, the squig, snotling, and Gretchen. Yet we see no notable issues derived from this. Normally, in most species, you would see the development and eventual pathogenicity of a prion disease from eating your own species. This is true of humans, cows, and just about anything else. There may be ways around this that'll become apparent shortly, but it is a bizarre phenomena to see. The growth of an adult orc is also truly fascinating. They grow based on adrenaline, and this is largely driven by violence. The more violence they engage in, the bigger the orc will grow. The more difficult the fight, the faster and more extreme this happens. Failure in a violent act will slow their growth, while success speeds it up. This is limited to a point by in-tribe fighting. The largest of these fights is known as a warg, and this is where the orcs will conglomerate in a very large number. The biggest orc will become the boss orc, and everyone else below that begins to grow bigger in an effort to fight them. Arguably, you could think of it as very much like a pyramid, and everybody's trying to get to the top. The bigger growth and violence is weird, but certainly not impossible at a surface level. During adolescence, a teenager will undergo growth spurts. These correspond with production of human growth hormone and other hormones. We also see something similar with insulin-like growth factor. To make it short, we'll simply call that IGF. IGF can cause a growth spike and would correspond with the increased need for energy from the violent acts of the orc. If the orc cell was to exhibit a marked increase in the IGF receptors during violence, and a corresponding increase in IGF secretion, this would lead to a significant increase in the orc's whole growth. This includes long bones, muscles, cartilage, and more. It would explain why violence causes more growth. It would also explain why more violence is needed to achieve greater results, if it is a dose-dependent result. That is, it needs to have a continuing increase, or at least increased supply, of IGF to meet the demand or dose required for more growth. It would also explain why, if the body continues to have a low-level activation of the receptors, we would see some growth no matter what, but we would also see an increase only when the availability increased. The orc is also a weird creature for biological, anatomical, and physiological reasons. It is an almost symbiotic organism. The brain is isolated from the body. The body has a rudimentary GI tract, heart, skeleton, and muscles. It also has a primitive fungus spread throughout the body, and as an almost gel layer between the musculoskeletal system and in the bone. This imparts flexibility, strength, and resistance to force. The fungus acts as a sort of quasi-blood. Liver, kidneys, lungs, spleen, pancreas, and more. The fungus lives in a fluid state where it filters the body, absorbs and distributes nutrition, and removes waste. This whole body fungal supply is supplanted, or at least supported, by very crude photosynthesis when there is no actual food available. The fact that the orc brain is separated and relatively immune to the fungus is interesting. The old brain, so to speak, of the orc is more pronounced. This is the part of the body that is responsible for basic bodily functions: breathing, heart rate, so on. The 4 F's of biology: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction, and almost all instinctual type behaviors. The fungus is something that we struggled with for a time. Could it be similar to the symbiosis of fungus mycelia and trees in the form of truffles? Or is it more like the parasitic fungi that infect ants, wasps, and other insects? We finally settled on the idea that it might be more akin to how human cells develop to have mitochondria. The mitochondria is a strange organelle, as it is hypothesized to be a foreign bacterium engulfed into the human cells in the earliest days of life. An approximation of enslavement, which allowed it to provide energy for the host cell. After many generations, the host cell simply started to copy the mitochondria as a part of the cell's normal contents. In this way, we believe the fungi and the conscious ork develop, but the conscious mind is separated out from the fungus and becomes a specialized organ. This is why it is kept separate, as like the human uterus, it is immunologically privileged as a site. That is somewhere where the immune system, or in this case fungus, cannot penetrate. You could to a point think of the ork brain as a developing fetus in the ork's head, but without the extraneous elements of a head, arm, legs, or body, being just a brain in a very large, angry green jar that has some but not entire control. Separating the brain from the body would also explain how the ork can continue to grow exponentially. If it was dependent on neurological control, the ork brain may not be able to produce enough peptides or other signals to meet the needs of a very large ork. The whole body fungus has another point worth noting. It facilitates very fast recovery from almost fatal damage with almost no further treatment but time. The fungus facilitates very fast recovery, and this raises questions about exactly what it is doing. To start with, we would need a very fast clotting function, followed by a meshing of collagen to create scar tissue. This would also need to be controlled so as to prevent development of tumours. In the case of an ork's teeth, we see this by the teeth that continually regrow, while older teeth simply fall out if violence is not responsible. It is possible that the fluid fungus throughout the body exhibits certain signals that could be increased when it's exposed to the outside environment. This would then explain some of the increase in cellular proliferation, but once it's confined once more, that site stops sending out those signals, and so cells stop proliferating, limiting the growth. But then this raises another question. The ork needs to separate where the fungus grows and where the ork body should grow. We see this in humans with teratomas, where multiple tissues grow together in one tumour. This can produce mixed results. For example, teeth developing in the middle of the tumour. We can see and explain how this happens several ways, but the one that jumps out is most likely that there's a very clear signal on the outside of the fungus, on the ork body cells, that make them mutually exclusive. It would explain why we can see, in some instances, orks able to heal severed limbs by forcefully attaching the two parts with very crude fastenings and letting the two parts heal together. Where the fungus might secrete the signal to heal, the fungus itself doesn't get in between the two tissues that are joining together. We noted early on that orks do not reproduce sexually. This adds an interesting layer to their genetic complexity, but also may explain why we see almost no change in the orks seen in Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. The idea of sexual reproduction allows for the mixing and changing of genetics, and to a certain extent, selection of more preferable genes. Without this, you can begin to see what we're seeing here to an extent: stagnation, or at least a relative unchanging environment. It could also be that there are no great selective pressures on the ork. They seem to be one of the few species in the Warhammer universe that are happy with the way things are. This whole situation also raises a question about self-limiting reproduction. Do orks simply get more violent and so more orks die to free room for more orks due to the way they reproduce, using spores? Or do they slow down spore production, like cells in a living organism? When cells begin to become cramped, they secrete signals to slow down or stop cellular proliferation. Both of these may be true or mutually exclusive, and it's hard to tell. In summary, to a point, yes, orks make sense. We say to a point as we have some significant reservations about the ork conscious mind and fungus separation issue, and just how the two are kept apart. Other than this, their body largely makes sense, and we can see how it happens, mostly. There are again some reservations about exactly how they function, But overall, compared to what we know of some other species, they seem to have taken some very selective processes and been able to use them effectively. And whilst yes, it is an entirely fictional species, the idea that they may have been developed by the old ones means that this could well be a designed species, and it's something that we're not far off doing now as humans. And it's worth bearing in mind as we go forwards that sometimes fiction can be stranger than truth, but also at times reality will follow the same route trod by fiction. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have below.